The church favored excommunication of slave owners and even reparations for slaves of any color.
But not just for Catholics, for Christians, and not just for Christians, but anyone who recognizes the horrific evil of slavery and wants to find the unanimous testimony of the church against it.
Yeah, and so the problem usually isn't God or Jesus or the Bible or the Christians or the church, but it's people who are falling short of the orders of the church.
Greetings, this is Scott Hahn, and I want to welcome you to The Road to Emmaus, a podcast from the St. Paul Center. And today, I'm going to have a conversation with a good friend, a great thinker, and an author who has written a book, The Worst of Indignities, the Catholic Church on Slavery, that is deservedly a classic for years to come. I want to welcome you, Dr. Paul Kengor.
It's great to be with you, my friend. Yeah. And it's the first time we've done this, right? First time we've done this, and you and I have known each other for probably close to 20 years.
Yeah,
actually.
I was thinking maybe 25. But
yeah,
when did you come back into the church?
Well, so that's how I'm dating this, right?
2005?
It was 2005.
Yeah.
It was April 2005. It was right when John Paul II died. And you and Kimberly were there. Right. That night that we
Church
came
of
in.
the Beloved Disciple.
Yeah, that's right. And I could date it back. In fact, I talk about this in the back of this book in the acknowledgement section. So you had called our mutual friend Michael Coulter,
right.
And Michael came into the church through you, and he's a colleague of mine at Grove City College.
And he was in my youth group way back in
right.
the early 80s.
Yeah, in Grove City, right? And Michael, you had called Michael, I think from the airport. And you probably forgotten this.
I sure did.
Yeah, and you said, I picked up at the airport this book called God and Ronald Reagan. And I couldn't stop reading it. So I couldn't put it down, bought it, read it on the plane. And I saw the authors from Grove City College. And Michael said, oh yeah, Paul Kengor, I know him well. And this is kind of classic Scott speak, right? He said, you could tell a lot from Kengor from reading this book, right? Which meant something about Catholicism. And I think it was probably the chapters on Reagan and John Paul II, right. Reagan and Mother Teresa.
That was exactly right.
Yeah. And then
because you were more than a little sympathetic.
Right. That's right. And I'm actually a revert.
Right.
So but I consider myself a convert.
Because you were a Tower Presbyterian, and you were an evangelical for
right.
probably as many years as you had been raised Catholic.
Well, that's right. And so I was a cradle Catholic, and my former pastor at Beloved Disciple, Mike Allison, used to say, don't say the word bad Catholic. There's no such thing as a bad Catholic. No, I was a bad Catholic. I was a really
Most of my
bad
friends in high
Catholic,
school, too.
Right?
Yes.
By the way, one of my former students says, why is it that only bad Catholics become Protestants, but only good Protestants become Catholics?
That's nice.
Yeah, it's a good point. But I was a bad Catholic, and I eventually, I became kind of saved by evangelicals. I shouldn't say that, I was baptized, right? But I was really brought into Christianity through them and became Presbyterian, and then became Catholic, converted back to Catholicism, reverted back. But so that book, God and Ronald Reagan, came out in 2004.
Right.
And then we set up a dinner with you and Kimberly, my wife Susan and I, and Michael and Laura Coulter at the Coulter's house. And you and I just started talking about books a lot, all the time. And that eventually led to all of this other stuff. And
You've published, what, 20 books?
Probably about 20. Yeah, I think about 20 books.
And some of them are gargantuan.
Well, some of them are pretty long. Yeah, I did A Pope and a President.
Oh, that's an amazing book.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's about 700 pages in print. And I turned in a manuscript that was over 300,000 words. Yeah. And likewise, I did a book called Dupes that was that long. And I've had people tell me, you got to write shorter books, right? And I'll aim for about 50,000 to 70,000 words. I think this is probably about 70,000.
Well,
yeah. And what does that come out to in print? Probably close to 300 pages.
It was our goal. It was under 300.
Yeah, 270 something.
Yep.
But I have a hard time saying what I want to say. It's not that I'm verbose, but I put a lot of material in, a lot of research.
Well, I mean, you did God and Bush, God and Reagan, and
right.
then God and Bush as well.
I did, and I did God and Hillary Clinton.
That's right, yes.
As well, which people said, well, why did you write that, right? Because I'm conservative, and I said, well, I wanted to write a book about, you can really call these books The Faith of, right? The Faith of Ronald Reagan, The Faith of George W. Bush. And at the time, she was running for president, and my editors wanted me, this was at HarperCollins, they wanted me to do more, quote, God and books, unquote. And I said, well, there's only so many of these I can do, and I have other things I like to do. And they proposed a couple of others, and I didn't do them. And I said, I'd like to do one on the Clintons. And the editor said, put that in an email right now, email me, hang up, email me right now. And they ended up focusing it on God and Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton was a case of somebody who's coming from the religious left. Right. And I wanted people on the sort of evangelical conservative Christian side to know there's an entire religious left out there. All right? I mean, Planned Parenthood has a chaplain of all things. So that's where she was coming from. And I know we don't want to talk about Hillary Clinton, but at one point she was against gay marriage. She was a big believer in religious freedom. But prior to that, there were some surprises about her and her Methodist faith. But she's since gone pretty far left on all of those issues, even to the left of the United Methodist Church.
Yeah, I mean, the liberals have gone leftist in a way that nobody really expected.
Yeah.
I want to mention just a pope and a president. We did a show with EWTN, and she was the guest. Likewise, you came and gave a lecture to a packed house, standing room only on that as well. And more recently, The Devil and Karl Marx. That book is full of surprises, but so is this one. And this is the one that we want to talk about.
Yeah.
You wrote an article, I want to say for Crisis?
It's for Crisis,
yeah,
correct.
I read it, and you nailed it. And I remember contacting you and thinking, this is inspired. I mean, I knew when we connected that this was destined to be a book, and a great one. And I honestly have to admit, this surpassed my rather high expectations.
Oh, good.
The research that you put into it, the broad spectrum
Well, you're
of
easily
issues
misled,
that you cover.
as my friend Bill Clark would say.
Yeah, Bill Clark. You wrote a book about him, too.
I did, yeah.
A judge. What was that again?
Yeah, the judge. Bill Clark was Ronald Reagan's closest friend and advisor, and a spiritual advisor, and a great Catholic man. Yeah. Wonderful.
I think who published
Ignatius
that?
Yeah. Ignatius Press, It was around 2006, 2007.
Yeah, so you're prolific, but in this book, you're doing something that should have been done 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
But you're doing it in a way that is extraordinarily timely because as we look at the emerging caliphate, we realize, okay, this is still with us.
Yeah, the Islamic State, ISIS. ISIS actually has slaves.
Yeah, and you also point out how, the idea of freeing, the idea of emancipation, abolition, did not move from Islam to Christianity, but Christianity putting pressure. But you were doing much more than this. You begin in sacred scripture, which to me is really important. And you not just begin in the New Testament, you begin in the Old. And you point out that really the foundation for Old Testament faith is the Exodus event and is a divine liberation of Israelite slaves from Egyptian captivity. But there's something more deeply rooted in this that I had noticed before, but you really call attention to it. As soon as they arrive at Sinai as freed slaves, they get the covenant, they get the law, they get the 10 commandments. And there in the third commandment, the Sabbath, is you keep the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And you and your sons and daughters, your manservants and your maidservants, and even the animals and the sojourners in the gates. It's like the Sabbath is not just for the elite. The Sabbath is for every person made in the image and likeness of God.
That's right. That's right.
And then you point out that as soon as the Decalogue is done in Exodus 20, the first set of laws in the so-called Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21 goes into a detailed description of manumission. That is how the masters set the slaves free after 6 years.
Right.
Again, it's not just the Sabbath day, it's the Sabbath year of freedom for the slaves. So it really ends up not being a divine institution of slavery, but indentured servitude.
Sure.
That is, these people are being trained, and then as they go forth, they can take a wife and they leave with her and all of that kind of thing as well. That's not what really anybody means by slavery.
No, in fact, the first slaves in America were indentured servants.
Right.
And they were white. In fact, there's a book called White Cargo, which came out, I think, around 2007 by Walsh, and that started. So we know of the 1619 Project, right? That the New York Times, others are talking about. The White Cargo, that started in 1618.
How ironic.
So one year before. So you got the white slaves in 1618. Then you've got the transatlantic black slaves, which people are dating 1619. The transatlantic slave trade started in 1444, so it's like 200 years before that. But you got 1618 white slaves, 1619 black slaves, 1620 the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, right? John Winthrop and the Arabella, 1630. But in 1618, with people think, well, indentured servants, that's different from the black slaves that came. It is, but there were about 300,000 white slaves that came from Britain to America, and not just as indentured servants, but they were auctioned, they were sold, they were whipped. I mean, they were terribly mistreated. I would argue that what the African black slaves went through was worse. But slavery has been here from the very beginning. And boy, just to talk about America, the American Indian tribes were
the so-called civilized
the
tribes.
civilized tribes. They had black African slaves throughout the 1800s, even after the Civil War, and they were treated really brutally. I mean, amputations, torture. They were. There are still to this day lawsuits by black American descendants of slaves against American Indian tribes.
And these are the so-called civilized
The civilized tribes. And now
so the
we
Cherokee, the Choctaw, they had
Exactly.
thousands of slaves.
thousands of them. And we now celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day
Right.
rather than Columbus Day, because Columbus, we feel, was bad on slavery and other things. Well, you want to replace them with Indigenous Peoples Day? They were doing slavery in the 1870s, man.
You point this out on page 47. The 5 civilized tribes were deeply committed to slavery, established their own racialized black codes, immediately reestablished slavery. When they arrived in Indian territory, rebuilt their nations with slave labor, crushed slave rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War.
Yeah, sided with the Confederacy.
This book is so full of insights and discoveries like this, and not just in American history, but you go back to Chinese history.
The Chinese, yeah, the Chinese. The Chinese had just so many millions of slaves.
Millions.
And I mean, the Great Wall was built with slave labor. Every culture. The one group that was the worst of all were the Muslims.
Right.
And that goes on to this day. There's still slavery in Islamic countries and in Islamic societies. But I quote at one point one of the Muslim sultans who's talking about the West and the Catholic Church trying to abolish slavery. And the sultan's like, I don't get this. I mean, this is what you do. You go, you take a territory, and you take slaves. And of course, in their case, they have backing for this in the Quran.
You're right. You say the plain words of the Quran and Muhammad that were decisive in stifling abolitionist movements within the Islamic world.
Yeah. And they've been at it for 1,500 years.
Well, there's a certain sense in which it follows, because I remember talking to a Muslim scholar who impressed upon me the profound metaphysical difference between Christianity and Islam. Christianity is a religion of divine sonship, where God is a father who sends his son to become a servant, who suffers and dies to make creatures who would not be sons of God by nature, but only sons of God by grace. But it's the grace of the crucified and suffering servant that turns these disobedient servants into sons.
That's right.
Who share the glory. And I mean, this Muslim scholar was basically impressing upon me, you have no idea how many layers of blasphemy and error are embedded in that set of beliefs. The Trinity, the Incarnation, the idea of deification for humans. And then he basically summarized by saying Islam is a religion of divine slavery. Well, Allah is master.
And if you look at, so Muslims will say that they recognize the prophet too, Jesus, right? They see Jesus as a prophet and Muhammad as a prophet. Well, you look at those two lives, the life of Jesus, right? Talking about freeing slaves, right? There is no Jew or Greek or Gentile or slave, non-slave, Galatians.
3:28.
Yeah, exactly. But with Muhammad, you have somebody who was actually a slave owner, who had harems, who had concubines. So it's a completely different standard altogether. And to this day, the last countries to abolish slavery have been Islamic countries. I mean, going into the 1970s, the 1980s. And I mean, you could Google right now, just type in, U.S. State Department report, Modern Slavery, and look at how in the 21st century, slavery has still gone on in the Sudan, and that is black Muslim slave owners taking black Christian slaves.
Right.
And so it's still going on. And this outraged a number of different black groups in America in the 1990s when they found out that slavery is still going on in Western Africa. They were horrified about this.
But there's a silence about
There's a silence about it. And instead, they want to talk about what happened in America 400 years ago, right? As opposed, and some of these black groups are really outraged about that. They said, okay, that's good. We could talk about that, but we've got to get over to where in Western Africa today and stop what's going on right there.
You know, you hear all the time about how slavery is America's original sin.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's highly unoriginal.
Right. Oh,
America wasn't the first, but like Britain, you already have in the writings of Jefferson and Washington, for that matter, and Benjamin Franklin. And not that they were strong Christians, devout evangelical Protestants or whatever, but I mean, they had in their conscience a deep stirring. They knew it was wrong.
Yeah, and
you
said
point out,
Yeah, they all said it. In fact, first of all, there's people like John Adams and Ben Franklin who never owned slaves. Franklin's last real public act was the head of the Pennsylvania Society
Right.
for the Abolition of Slavery. There are beautiful statements from them, so eloquent. Abigail Adams, all of them speaking out against it. But then there were slave owners like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson who you read some of their statements, they knew it was wrong.
they abhorred it, but they wouldn't attack it.
They said the wolf has us by the tail, right? The devil had them by the tail. In fact, I go through all the different attempts long before the Civil War in America to abolish slavery and the importation of slaves by the founders.
Yeah.
But in a sense, they were stuck because Washington had like 316 slaves in his possession. He needed them for the farm labor in order to keep the farm profitable, but he knew it was wrong. This is the key. He knew it was wrong. And they would say, he and Jefferson would say, there is nobody more than me that would like to see that an end put to it. But and also in 1776, they couldn't abolish it in 1776 because the southern states wouldn't have been on board.
That's right.
For the Declaration of Independence. You couldn't just in one fell swoop with one document at that time end slavery, but they put in place the principles, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness that allowed somebody like Abraham Lincoln to come along later, 77 years later, as he put in the Gettysburg Address in 1863. He's referring to 1776. And at that point, put forth the proposition that all men are created equal. So it's going to take really two wars, the American Revolution and the Civil War, in order to abolish slavery. Thomas Sowell, who I quote a lot,
he's amazing.
just a brilliant Black American writer. He points out what's unique about America is not that we had slaves, because almost every country did and culture did, but that we abolished slavery through the deadliest war in the history of our country. You had over 600,000. And I was talking to Michael Medved about this on Friday. Michael Medved's really into this issue. Medved said the latest scholarship on the Civil War, maybe 700,000 boys died in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Scott, the population of the country was only about 30 million.
Yeah.
But that would be, even if it's 600,000, the standard number, that's more deaths in the Civil War than all the combined deaths of all American boys in all wars in the history of our country. World War I, World War II, all of them. So we lost, we went through this horrific war of white boys killing white boys to end slavery in the country. And even long after that, American Indian tribes were still engaging in slavery. Brazil didn't end it until 1888. Of the transatlantic slave trade, which began in 1444, less than 5% of those slaves came to North America. Mm. And in fact, probably one estimate is about 4.4% came to North America. Brazil was the largest slave country. So that would be, if we're doing racial identification here, and I hate that garbage, right? But that would be Brazil, darker skinned people than in North America, right? I don't know if you want to call them
people of color or whatever.
Exactly. It'd probably be called people of color. Had the largest number of slaves. I talk about Blessed Francisco de Paula Victor, who was in 1827, 1905, and he's a blessed, and he was the first person of color. Actually, he was a black African slave who became a priest in Brazil and faced horrific discrimination. People refused to get the Eucharist from him. Eventually, he won them over through his kindness and decency, but he didn't die until early 1900s. He was a Brazilian slave.
But in particular, what you were pointing out was how highly unoriginal the sin of slavery has been in America. America was, like most all other countries, slave owning. And then you had the Emancipation Proclamation and abolition as well. And I want to just make mention of the fact that there are three ways to liberate those who are in slavery. Manumission is the biblical basis, where you have indentured servants who are set free after 7 years. Mm-hmm. Then you have this sort of emancipation by government decree. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, abolition is where the government outlaws slavery altogether and not merely declares the slaves to be free. I'm going to save for a later conversation the strange phenomenon that we have in America today that I privately refer to as the federal plantation, where a government abolishes slavery and then ends up a century later making a form of slavery much more subtle and yet at the same time more dehumanizing, or at least every bit as much, But the thing that I really want to focus on now, if you don't mind, is building from Scripture, the Old and the New Testament, the Catholic Church's consistent teaching against slavery.
Right.
And I think we can already gesture towards the conclusion, and that is, when we think about Humanae Vitae and contraception, when we think about other teachings of the Catholic Church today that are highly unpopular, we recognize that if 70% of Catholics don't even affirm the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right, we shouldn't be shocked that like 90% don't follow the Church's teaching against contraception. You have the Church's teaching, and then you have Catholic practices, and you look and you realize that for 2,000 years, something like a Grand Canyon has been there. The gulf between the Church's teaching and what we are actually practicing. So
they don't know it. People don't know this history. And I mean, slavery goes back, according to biblical scholars, 6,000, 8,000 years, right? And in fact, it's usually dated back to ancient Mesopotamia. And if you look, I mean, ancient Mesopotamia is where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers met.
The cradle of civilization.
Yeah, which is modern day Iraq, by the way.
Yes.
And so, ironically, right, where the Islamic State has tried to set up, ISIS has tried to set up there. But the Tigris and Euphrates, and this is in Genesis, that's the home of the Garden of Eden.
Right.
So slavery goes back to the dawn of humanity. I mean, this goes back multiple thousands of years. Ask anybody who's Jewish, right? I mean, the Jews have probably been slaves longer than any other group, right? Ancient Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Nebuchadnezzar, the Pharaoh, I mean, on and on and on. So it's nothing new with American history. But the one group that comes along to provide a moral sense, a moral argument for abolishing it, is Christians.
That's right.
The Catholic Church. And in America, the abolitionist movement was spearheaded by Christians. John Brown, who some people consider a domestic terrorist, right? But John Brown was this white Christian leader who was doing everything he could, even using violence to try to help.
Quite a fair bit of it.
Exactly.
Right.
To free black African slaves. I mean, so it was good. And people say, but you had the Southern Christian Bible man with a whip in one hand and a Bible in the other. Well, true, but those guys were not following the scriptures, right? They were quoting them selectively. It was Christians, moral people, churches that led the fight against it in America, and with the Catholic Church, going back to
14. Council
of Ogda, the year 506. Koblenz, Worms, right? 922. Go back further. St. Patrick was a slave. Say in the country of redheaded, pale white-skinned Irishmen, right? I mean, St. Patrick was a slave writing against slavery, and that was around the year 400. St. Gregory the Great from 506 or late 500s, 5th, 6th century, was a slave who wrote against slavery. So they had been against it for a long time, and you start getting formal papal bulls, encyclicals about the year 1434.
Right.
That's really where it starts.
Now, on page 87, you list all of the councils, all of the official teachings.
So many of them.
Yeah, there's so many of them
So
in the
many of
first Christian millennium. You know, you have slavery in ancient Israel, but you had slavery, as you pointed out, you know, in Babylon, which is modern Iraq, going back to the Tower of Babel, the Persians, which is modern Iran, you know, but you have it also the Sumerians, the Phoenicians, and most notably the Egyptians.
Right.
So it was practically the case that every civilization had slavery institutionalized. Now, when you look at Greco-Roman sources, I found, to my surprise, the treatment of slaves, they were considered members of the household. In fact, the word family comes from the Latin famulus, and when you find usages of famulus, it naturally includes the servants who were considered domestics. You know,
Right.
I'm not defending it. I'm
No,
just
sure.
saying that the idea of slavery as being monolithic. You know, there are so many different forms of it.
That's
Just
exactly
as today, you know, the idea that you can enslave people. Well, take a close look at the dehumanizing tendencies in any prison or penitentiary. I think that is also a kind of enslavement. I mean, I'm not going to get into the moral issues, but you mentioned in our previous episode Galatians 3:28, you know, where Paul is describing what baptism does that goes beyond circumcision, what the new covenant accomplishes in fulfilling the old, but going beyond the highest expectations of the Hebrew people. And so after introducing baptism in Galatians 3, Paul goes on to say that there's neither, you know, Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female, neither slave nor, well, in the Old Testament, circumcision was given to males, not females, only Israelites who were free, not to slaves. And so what Paul is doing here is basically identifying this eruption of divine grace that has come through the incarnation. Now, it isn't as though the apostles went out as abolitionists performing violent acts to bring it down.
Right.
You can see that when Paul speaks to the Corinthians about slavery, if you were a slave when you were baptized, you know, but if you get an opportunity to be freed, go for it, you know. But my favorite illustration in your book is what you find in the book of Philemon, where Onesimus, who's a runaway slave, whose name in Greek means useful, and Paul is sending him back to his slave owner, but basically saying, look, I gave you the freedom of Christ, Philemon, so you give your slave the freedom of Christ.
That's right.
Set him free because he's so useful to me.
Right. Yeah, he's he's really one of the first, and the and also too, not everybody that opposed slavery or tried to help slaves try to become an abolitionist because you're fighting this whole structure, right? I mean, the cover of this book, that's Peter Claver, St. Peter Claver, who I think is the most remarkable of all of them. And somebody, if they really wanted to nitpick, could say, well, what did he do to actually try to end slavery? Well, I don't know if he tried to do anything to end it legally, right? I mean, but what he did was he would sit there in the shore, right? This is around the year, this is in the 1600s, right? 1610s, 1620s. And he's waiting on a little rowboat with an oarsman. He wants to be the first to get out there, to get on the slave ships, to go down into the belly of these ships where even the hardened sailors wouldn't go down in there because the stench was so bad. The people were dying, decaying, and rotting. And Peter Claver goes in there. People actually claimed they could see a halo around Peter Claver. He would go down there. He would nurse these people. He would take off his cloak. He would wipe the mucus off. He would wipe their ulcers. He would kiss their faces. They couldn't believe. Pope Leo XIII said, nobody other than Jesus Christ himself has impressed me as much as Peter Claver. He called himself the slave of the slaves, right? The slave to the Negroes. I mean, this guy is a saint for great reasons, but he didn't try to actually spearhead an abolitionist movement because he couldn't. But there were orders. St. John de Matha, his order of the Most Holy Trinity, 11th century, a whole order created to ransom slaves. Peter Nolasco, another one.
Slaves from whom?
Yeah,
in the 11th century, it would have been from Muslims.
Yeah,
among others, but especially.
That's exactly right at that point. Yeah, the transatlantic slave trade starts in about the year 1444. I read one criticism that said, while the Catholic Church didn't condemn the slavery of blacks until the year 1434. Well, okay, that would be Sicut Dudum, Eugene IV,
Right.
in the year 1434, which is called Against the Enslavement of Black Indians in the Canary Islands. First of all, that's 10 years before the slave trade even started, the transatlantic slave trade even started. It's almost 60 years before Columbus. And one might argue at that point, well, yeah, so why wasn't the church condemning it in formal encyclicals when it was happening to Christians and Jews and Gentiles from the first century to 1434, right? But as far as the black slave trade, the church was out in front on that one. And it wasn't perfect. One of the popes I talk about, Nicholas V, with Dum Diversus and another encyclical, these are very odd. They're complete anomalies. They're very strange. And it talks about perpetual enslavement. I spent a lot of time on it in the book. I interviewed a lot of different people on it. But that would be the only pope from a period of formal encyclicals running from 1434 with Sicut Dudum through, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti and Francis encyclicals to this day condemning modern slavery. Paul III issued Sublimus Deus in 1535, I think it was. And they're calling for the excommunication of people who own slaves. We had popes in the 1500s, another one, 1591, with Manila Islands in the Philippines, calling for reparations for slaves, The church favored excommunication of slave owners and even reparations for slaves of any color.
Justice, which is restitution.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's exactly what Exodus 21 also mandates. But ancient Israelites seldom kept the covenant. There is not any evidence that ancient Israel ever kept the Jubilee. Or even the sabbatical year. Perhaps they did, but when you read the narratives, you point out in Jeremiah 34, Jeremiah was so pleased when the rulers in Jerusalem announced the manumission of slaves until they realized that's going to be costly. So they rescinded it.
Sure. Yeah, and so the problem usually isn't God or Jesus or the Bible or the Christians or the church, but it's people who are falling short of the orders of the church. Right, of the faith. The problem is people. It's not God. It's people.
You have a marvelous treatment of Francisco de Vitoria, beginning around page 159. It goes on, but it's not just like one figure who is exceptional. You also have the Salamancans, you have the Dominicans, Melchior Cano, Dominic de Soto, but especially Bishop de la Casas.
Oh, he's amazing.
I mean, these are heroic figures, but all they're doing is sort of like Catholic math.
Right.
Read the old, fulfilled by the new. You can see slaves who are baptized and then freed end up, whether they're freed or not, becoming bishops over their own former slave owners,
Yeah.
And so it isn't a kind of military assault. It's not political subversion. It's a spiritual transformation that takes divine patience with us, but at the same time takes saints who are willing to suffer like our Lord to set us, to set people free.
Right, and the Salamancans. So that's the University of Salamanca in Spain, and people will point out that the Spanish were the worst slavers in the Western world. Actually, Brazil was worse, but they probably were. The Spanish Empire was probably the worst. But you have all along during this period, you have these priests, Dominican priests, order of preachers, right? Montesinos, giving a sermon called "I Am the Voice Crying in the Wilderness." De las Casas, who was pro-slave early on, and then eventually becomes a bishop of Chiapas, is actually run out of a church in Nicaragua because of his preaching against slavery. People are so angry at him. But those figures, all from the 1500s to the 1600s, Vitoria is known as the father of international law.
Right.
And I quote in the long section on him a couple modern people who say, well, but he supported this and that and this and that. Again, you can go to any of these individuals and find flaws and things you don't like about it, but they're all struggling within the context of their time. Peter Claver, who wiped the mucus from these slaves and kissed their faces, didn't end slavery. He couldn't. They're all dealing with it, doing what they can. Progress in history comes in bits and pieces. In the United States, July 4th, 1776, you get the proposition all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it's going to take Lincoln and a civil war to actually bring that to all Americans, Black Americans. So it takes time. An institution of slavery that's 10,000 years old, you're not gonna knock it out in one or two pieces of legislation in every country in the world.
Yeah, but you were pointing out something that I remember Father Panzer published his book, The Popes and
That's
Slavery.
a really good book.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it existed until about 2 years ago when I started doing the research on
Right.
this.
I know Father Panzer, and I think I might have been the one to recommend it to you.
You
because
did.
it was practically lost as soon as it was published by Oberhaus. But he points out the consistency of the papal teaching, that it's clear, it's heroic, it's always a minority report. But what you're pointing out is it's not just the popes. It's the councils, it's the saints, it's the doctors of the church, it's the Jesuits, it's the Dominicans. And even though the theologians take longer to kind of catch up to the clarity of papal teaching or the conciliar teaching in the first millennium, time and again, the Catholic Church is so far ahead. But in a certain sense, the Vicar of Christ, along with these councils, are basically echoing the words of Christ, that I've come to set you free. The truth shall set you free.
Yeah, and also, too, a lot of the laity, I mean, in as much as there were laity who were bad, but I give an example in one section of the book. I talk about 3 modern slaves. So Venerable Pierre Toussaint, who was American, Augustus Tolton, who some people consider the first Black priest in the United States, and Josephine Bakhita, who's my favorite. And in each of those cases, they met kindness from white Catholics. In the case of Toussaint, so Toussaint had slave owners who were, and people are going to probably take the wrong meaning of this, had slave owners who were kind to him. Okay. Now others like Bakhita had slave owners who were brutal. I mean, carved her up, sadistically carved her up, put flour and salt. They called this tattoos. Horrific what they did to Bakhita. But then Bakhita is bought by this Italian who's visiting Sudan and brought back to Italy, and there she is shown kindness. And nuns bring her in, and the bishop fights for her, and they get her freed, and Italy abolishes slavery. In Toussaint's case, his owners actually let him work. He became a hairdresser in New York, made a lot of money, and he loved his owners so much that when the father died and the wife was penniless, he subsidized her. And he said, "You were so kind to me, now I want to be kind to you." Now, it's still wrong to own slaves, right? But they freed him, and they were kind to him. And Augustus Tolton, he faced discrimination where he came from, but he was brought in by this kind priest and these kind nuns who tried to get him into every seminary in the United States, all of which turned him down. So there's the cruelness, right? The cruelty. But eventually they sent him to Rome. And in Rome, the Catholic Church welcomes him because they have priests from all over the world. And Tolton is hoping he'll get sent to Africa. And the cardinal says, "No, we're going to see how enlightened America really is. We're going to send you the first Black priest." Well, he goes back to his hometown, and he's treated like a hero. They throw like a ticker tape parade for him. They love him. Right?
Yeah, the book that Deacon Harold Burke Sivers wrote about Tolton is such an inspiration. But your treatment of Bakhita as well as Toussaint, I mean, this is what makes the book not only informative theologically, historically, politically, but inspiring spiritually. That you're focusing.
She's very inspiring, what she goes through.
And I think it was Pope Benedict who wrote an encyclical on hope that focused upon Bakhita.
Yeah.
And what a source of living hope she is for us.
Right.
But at the end of our second segment, what I'd like to do is, kind of paraphrasing de Tocqueville, the fact is our passions are what forged the chains of our slavery. So you can sense that, when Israel was in Egyptian bondage, there was a liberation of sorts that took place with the Exodus. But 40 days later, Moses comes down from the top of Mount Sinai and sees the golden calf. It's one thing to bring Israel physically, geographically out of Egypt. That took a matter of days. But it took a matter of centuries to take Egypt out of Israel.
Sure.
And so the new and greater Exodus, which is the new and greater covenant by the new and greater Moses, Jesus Christ, is not sort of like, well, that's dessert. No, that's the main course. Apart from Christ, we're going to end up forging the chains of our own bondage through habits and addictions and that sort of thing too. So, it's not just the truth that sets us free. Jesus says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So the truth is out there objectively. The Father sends the Son in the power of the Spirit to become a servant who suffers and dies, to transform sinful servants into grateful sons and daughters. This good news is sort of like, yeah, ho-hum, we profess these truths when we go through the creed, but they're more like precious gems, on a thread that we, this necklace, this creed of ours is the source of the freedom. And it's also, even if it goes unacknowledged, even if it goes attacked by supposed people who oppose slavery, I have to say one thing that's just been, it's occurred to me throughout my reading of your book and rereading it as well, that Marxism has always championed this kind of freedom, from oppression, from injustice, from slavery. And yet Marxism probably has surpassed Islam or any other ideology going back to the Han dynasty in China in terms of enslaving and murdering
over
in the
100 million
name of
dead.
justice.
Right.
It is, and you've written about this. And so this book is a piece of a larger corpus that I hope people discover.
Well, I talk in the end, too, about critical race theory today and what that does. I mean, Marxist-based critical race theory. So Marxists who are involved in critical race theory, they take the Marxist superstructure of oppressed versus oppressor, which in classical Marxism is based on economics. Bourgeoisie, proletariat, you're in the oppressed group or the oppressor group. And race-based Marxists today that do that stuff do the same thing with black versus white. And I quote Archbishop Gomez quite a bit, who gave just a beautiful speech on this a couple years ago. But it's the same thing. It's the pitting of people into groups. Like Martin Luther King Jr. said, all that should really matter is that we're all created as children of God in the image of God. And once you do that and you understand that, then your race shouldn't matter, your class shouldn't matter. And the problem with slavery is that it didn't acknowledge that people were all equal, made in the image of God. And even today, so we have these creeds, we have these beliefs, and we're so enlightened today. But there are organizations out there today claiming that there are more people living in slavery today than any other time in history. Now, it's not the same as it was with the transatlantic slave trade, but sex trafficking.
I was going to say human trafficking, the sound of
horrible.
freedom, what Jim Caviezel has opened
Tens
up.
of millions of cases of this. And of course, most people in the world, or at least in the West where we are against that. And we all know it, but it's still going on.
Right. And we can decry it, but how do you just abolish it? Well,
Right.
It's going
That's
to
the
take
hard
a
part.
generation or more. I don't like this self-congratulatory posture of so many elitists who say, we have arrived at a moral perspective that is so much superior to Christianity. But Marxism in particular, it seems to me to be the most parasitical of all the ideologies out there. Because you ask any Marxist, just be consistent and explain to us the transcendent source of moral judgment whereby you say the oppressor is evil and the oppressed is good. Well, they have no frame of reference.
No, they don't.
They've got no basis, and
No,
so
Marx has to make it up.
that's right. And it's the it's the residue of Christianity. It's residual capital, as it were.
Which Marx called a religion of cowardice,
Right.
of self-abasement, contempt, self-sacrifice. Marx didn't like any of that.
Yeah, and so in the name of liberating the oppressed, he ends up instantiating oppression in a global way without any moral justification, all in the name of what? Freedom. I mean, this is the father of lies.
His definition of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, this is why your book, The Devil and Karl Marx, is also a must-read. And so I'm grateful.
It's not as inspiring as this one, I'll tell you that.
Exactly. It is dreary.
It's nice to write one for a change that's actually inspiring, that has a happy ending.
No, we need saints. The crisis of our age, like the crisis of every preceding age.
St. Peter Clavers and St. Patrick, Gregory the Great, Bakita. Bakita, again, is such an inspiring story, and she died not even 100 years ago, just in the last century. And
the lumen, the light of the saint is the warmth that melts the hard hearts that enslave.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, those are such inspiring cases.
Yeah.
I think everybody should know who Peter Claver was.
Your section
phenomenal
at the
story.
climax of that chapter is itself deserving of a book.
He's just amazing. We had to put him on the cover. He's our cover boy.
Yeah. Well, this book, The Worst of Indignities, where you're quoting a pope.
Yeah, Pope Pius X.
Yeah.
Who called slavery an instrument of Satan, as did Pope Paul III in 1537. Yeah. So we have popes, sainted popes, who said that this is not just a product of wicked men. Where does slavery come from? By the way, they said the same thing about communism. Pope Pius X did as well. They said it is created by Satan. It is an instrument of Satan.
Pope St. Pius X. Yes.
That's right. That's right.
Very few popes have been sainted in the 20th century. But, this book, The Catholic Church on Slavery, is, as I mentioned at the conclusion of our first segment, this is a cause of deep gratitude and great pride on the part of Emmaus Road Publishing and the St. Paul Center. Your article that appeared in Peter Samuel on Crisis, that was the sign to me that this has to become a book. But it also has to become a movement. America is different than all of the other European countries. They were all Catholic at one point. Then they became Protestant. At least many of them did. You think of England and so on. We were never Catholic.
Right.
And so as a country that had slaves, that embraced Protestantism in a variety of forms, I would say our Catholic moment might still be up ahead.
Yeah. And we had some bad Catholics here. Georgetown, the university, owned slaves.
Sold slaves, yeah.
Yeah, there were religious orders that had slaves. So I want to make clear to people that it's not perfect, right? It's not perfect, but you really can't find an institution over a longer period of time more consistently. And there's bumps, there's curves, there's imperfections, no question about that. Right. Even a bad pope, I think, with probably Nicholas V, Dum Diversus and what he did. But overall, the series of popes from about 1434 to 2023, this is a pretty astonishing record. No one else can match it.
And even that one pope who stands out as the vicar of Christ who kind of succumbed to the zeitgeist. I mean, we have that in every age, including our own, too.
Right. And
it really is a call for discernment.
And that case with Nicholas V, it's really hard to figure out. It really is. I mean, I encourage people to do good scholarship on it. Yeah. I don't like what I see with it, but I literally emailed over 100 people, and I could quantify that. In fact, an entire email list of Catholic scholars trying to figure out what does this mean? Yeah. And we can't even get the exact date correct on these. They're around the time of the fall of Constantinople too. And he uses phrases like perpetual slavery, and we're all trying to figure out, but what you can't do as a scholar, all right, as a good scholar, is take that one or two and say, well, here you go. You can't do that. It's clearly an anomaly within this much longer, larger record. So you need to deal with this stuff, charitably, sensibly.
Right. In the realm of theology, there's always Pope Honorius, who was not an avowed Monophysite or Monothelite, and yet the very fact that he officially tolerated that kind of teaching was enough to have him condemned by an ecumenical council later on.
Right.
But in the day, it was really a failure of nerve as well as truth, that was being obscured. Our guest today has been a dear friend of many years, Dr. Paul Kengor, professor at Grove City College, but most notably, the author of this very new book, The Worst of Indignities, The Catholic Church on Slavery. This is deservedly, and I think destined to be a Catholic classic, but not just for Catholics, for Christians, and not just for Christians, but anyone who recognizes the horrific evil of slavery and wants to find the unanimous testimony of the church against it. So thanks for joining me.
Well, and thank you for asking me to write it. And I was inspired by the Crisis Magazine piece. And I would say if you homeschool, if you're in a Catholic school, read this, because we need to know what our side. This is a great story. We believe that there's a Holy Spirit speaks to this thing called the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Once again, this is evidence that it must, because these men were so outside and ahead of their times, and they were just men, that it could, to some degree, only be Spirit-led.
It puts you in direct contact with the Word of God and the power to transform lives, but also the power of the truth taught by the Church. But above all, the deeper power of saints.
Yes.
They're the ones who really transform society.
They really are. That's one of the greatest things about being Catholic, is having those examples. I mean, you have the first century apostles and disciples, but we've got then 2,000 years of Bakitas and Toussaints and Clavers and Matha and Patrick and Gregory, on and on and on. These are just incredible stories.
Well, thank you again, Paul, for joining us, and thank you all for listening in or watching. Please share the Road to Emmaus podcast with family members and friends, and until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.